Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the director, Susan Weber, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you this morning to the Bard Graduate Center, those of you here in this room and those of you out there somewhere watching the live stream. It should be a very interesting day. I want to start with just a little bit of structure and thanks, and then a few remarks about why we're actually here. In terms of structure, I'll speak for a few minutes, and then we will have the first of our speakers, Matthew Battles, who will talk, and then there'll be questions following that, and a coffee break. And then we will have the first of two panels, the morning panel devoted to physical objects, and that'll be three speakers sequentially, and then they will come up to the table in front, and we will have a joint question and answer period. And following lunch, second panel on living objects, constructed the same way, three speakers, and then a joint question period, coffee break, and a concluding general discussion. I'd like to thank, first of all, the speakers who've come here and joined us today. In particular, I want to thank one of the speakers, Friedemann Helwig, who is actually watching us from his home in Hamburg. He was injured in the course of doing the research for his talk, and so has been generous enough to make the presentation through video link. At the Bard Graduate Center, I want to thank, first of all, Dr. Alina Bloch, the Associate Director for Research Programs, who's been in charge of organizing this. Also, Elena Pinto-Simon, Dean for Academic Administration and Student Affairs, for their help in supporting and making this day possible. Also, the members of the Steering Committee for Cultures of Conservation, Gabrielle Berlinger, Hannah Hölling, Ivan Gaskell, Jeffrey Collins, and Aaron Glass. Why extreme? One could say that there's enough to know and to find out about conservation without modifying it with extreme. And I guess the question is what one gains by pushing something to an extreme. I confess to having been inspired by the idea of extreme sports, pushing people to the limits of their physical capacity in order to observe the psychological effects that it produces is something that actually is interesting for those of us in the human sciences as well. It's Carlo Ginzburg who talked about the extraordinary ordinary, after all, the idea that we can look at extremes in order to understand something about the commonplace, which otherwise we might not notice, a little bit like the kind of raking light that conservators use to discover objects and features of objects that are otherwise less visible. So in a way, the extreme is just a way of testing for the norm rather than something that has to be either wild and far out, which would be one way of thinking about extreme, or super intensified, which might be another way of thinking about extreme. In our context today, as you may have noticed from looking at the program, there is no straightforward discussion of conservation in the way that most people think about conservation, paintings conservation, or objects conservation. We're not talking here about conservation as a form of authentication or verification, establishing provenance or authorship. Those are not our questions, even though those may be both the most common way of thinking about conservation, and indeed it may be the day job of our speakers here today. But in a way, what we're looking for is the broader range of questions that conservators deal with, pushing to those extremes in order to understand better the nature of the practice itself. One of the very interesting features of current intellectual life seems to be the rise of experiential knowledge. Just anecdotally, in 4 days here a couple of weeks ago, we had 3 different speakers. One person talking about the early book, the Codex in the Eastern Mediterranean. A second pardon me, talking about an early 17th century recipe book, and a third talking about 10th and 11th century rock crystal ewers. And each of them, in order to understand the object that they were studying, made it or worked with someone, an artist or a fabricator, who made the objects. This notion that one can learn from the process about the making is something that seems to be in the air. And in a way, conservators, of course, have been doing this for a very long time, right? Making and knowing in a historical perspective is what conservators do. But I suppose what I would like to suggest is that this current interest in experiential knowledge tends to focus much more narrowly on the moment in which an object is made. The making of the object is, in fact, foregrounded in all of these approaches. And of course, it is very useful to know about how the objects are made. But there is another dimension of conservation, and for those who are in this room, perhaps it's preaching to the choir, but that is the way in which conservation is a form of archaeology. And here, just to read a few words from a wonderful brief essay of Marguerite Yourcenar called Time, the Mighty Sculptor, or That Mighty Sculptor Time, which focuses on precisely this second aspect of conservation. And she starts exactly at this point. On the day when a statue is finished, its life, in a certain sense, begins. The first phase, in which it has been brought by means of the sculptor's efforts out of the block of stone into human shape, is over. A second phase, stretching across the course of centuries, through alternations of adoration, admiration, love, hatred, and indifference, and successive degrees of erosion and attrition, will bit by bit return it to the state of unformed mineral mass out of which its sculptor had taken it. And she goes on, in these remains, the entire man is there. His intelligent collaboration with the universe, she's referring to the artist, his intelligent collaboration with the universe, his struggle against it, and that final defeat in which the mind and the matter which supported him perish almost at the same time. What he intended affirms itself forever in the ruin of things. What she is signaling is a forensic dimension, thinking of conservation as a way of capturing that entire post-creation lifespan, the spectrum of life beyond and after its emergence. So here at the Bard Graduate Center, as we explore the way in which conservation knowledge can be integrated into humanities education at the graduate level, we need to do so at the full breadth of what conservation does. And therefore, something like today's discussion, the extreme questions, the lives of objects after they are made, not just how they are made, is important for us to think about. The Andrew W. Mellon Foundation-supported initiative, Cultures of Conservation, is about bringing humanist scholars into contact directly with conservators, conservation scientists, in order to expand the palette of questions that the humanities scholars feel comfortable asking with the knowledge that there are answers to be given out there by conservators and conservation scientists, and similarly to suggest to the conservators and the conservation scientists that there are questions beyond those which they might be working on in their day jobs, for which their knowledge could be extremely, extremely useful. In the public events, for instance, in our initiative this year, we've had conversations between conservators and humanists on the conservation of Native American objects, conservation of the future. That discussion is coming up, of course, in the future on March 31st. We've had a discussion of conservation of the home, and we've had a presentation of an existing partnership between a conservator and a humanist. So what we have here today is a way of deepening our understanding of the cultural history of the material world by bringing people together who work on aspects of that material legacy which deepen and enrich our notion of what can be known and what kinds of questions can be asked. I should say that the prompts for doing something like this are, of course, all around us, and with this really I will conclude. A book written by our first speaker and Jeffrey Schnapp, The Library Beyond the Book, which was published, I think, in September or October of this year, states very, very clearly a point which all of us think about in a variety of ways, which is how, as an increasing share of human knowledge moves into the digital realm, the question of its conservation moves from being an issue of importance only to professionals in the field to actually being an issue that concerns anyone who cares about the human legacy. So conservation may be, in fact, the single most important cultural issue that we will face, and that's just thinking about knowledge. If one then thinks about the implications for society of climate change, then the question of conservation of cultural heritage, conservation of daily life, becomes a crucial one for everyone. So these extreme issues may, in fact, be more the norm in the future than the exception. And with that, I will begin the formal part of the day. Just to say that those of you who are out there and wish to ask your questions can tweet them in to hashtag BardGradCenterTV, and that's on Twitter, and we have a device to keep track of your questions, and we will feed them at appropriate moments to our speakers.